So let's get started on this image of Keep. We're going to start in our raw processor, and here our objectives are going to be to balance the overall skin color and luminosity. And this is going to save us a lot of time down the line once we get into Photoshop. The tools we'll be using are the white balance, the exposure sliders, and we'll also be using a soft proofing assist and optionally the adjustment brush. So let's get started. First, let's take a closer look at the raw processor. Here, of course, you're welcome to use whatever raw processor is your preference. This can be Lightroom or Camera Raw. Those two are completely interchangeable in terms of their under-the-hood technology. The only difference is a little bit of the interface. However, you can also use an alternate raw processor such as Capture One, for example. The most important thing is to choose a program that will extract the full raw information. So at this point, we should figure out which adjustments are better to be made in RAW versus once we get into Photoshop. Now, the benefits of making changes in a RAW processor is that we have the full image information available. So whatever your camera captured, you can find it here, and that is both in terms of exposure as well as in terms of the white balance. Meanwhile, once we get into Photoshop, what we have imported is what we get. We lose a lot of that raw flexibility once the image becomes rasterized. Let me show you an example. If we import the image looking like this, and then try to bring back that overexposure in Photoshop, we are not going to be very successful. As you can see, we're going to run into a ton of, image damage. Meanwhile, here in Lightroom, we still have that full image information available. Of course, this is a bit of an extreme example, but still, I think it motivates us to use our programs and tools in the most efficient and effective way possible. So, making full use of the raw information is, of course, the primary benefit of the raw processor. And on the other hand, the benefit of working in Photoshop is, of course, that we have much higher flexibility in terms of our tools and adjustments. Everything can be masked, and there's just so much more available to us. So, in this case, since we're working with a very simple raw processor such as Lightroom, we're going to stick to only the essential adjustments. But of course, you are welcome to work with more complex changes in the raw processor if you'd like, especially if you're working in a more advanced and flexible program such as Capture One. So, what are the essential adjustments that we really cannot make once the image is rasterized? Well, the first one is to bring back any information that might have been lost in under or overexposure. The second one is to focus our attention on the skin and bring it to as close of a balanced point as possible. Why the skin? Why should we focus on the skin? Why is the skin so important? Well, I'm going to be bold and assume that you watching this are a human, not an alien, so you are most likely naturally, tuned to recognize skin and see it every single day, and also naturally recognize when something is off about it. My point that I'm trying to make here is that damaging skin is very noticeable, because we all know what skin should or shouldn't look like. So, in summary, our approach here is to build a strong base, specifically in the skin color and luminosity. Let's get started. Personally, I like to start with the white balance. Unless our image is heavily over or underexposed, then I'll get it into a solid general range first with the exposure slider, and then, start with the white balance. What is really the benefit of a well white balanced image? Accurate white balance gives us two major benefits. One of them is going to be accurate skin color. So what that means is keep skin looks like it does in real life. And another benefit that we get is full color variability. Now, what is color variability? This refers to the range of hue and saturation values in an image. So I'll show you an example. If we bump up the saturation all the way to 100, and we've got a bit of a cooler color temperature going on here, we're going to notice that everything is in the blue channel. So the canvas is blue, her hair is blue, her eyes are blue, her skin is blue. Meanwhile, if we shuffle this over to a warmer point, everything is going to be in the yellow channel. So the canvas becomes yellow, and so on. Now, there is a point somewhere in between that there is balance. So actually every color is properly represented. The blue canvas becomes blue, the skin tone becomes skin tone, the lips are red, her eyes are blue, and so on. This is what it looks like when we have proper white balance and maximum color variability. Everything is in its own channel. The opposite of maximum color variability would be color uniformity. So this is what we're going to try to avoid. The main benefit of color variability is that it is, once again, the most accurate representation of the real-life colors, but also that you have the most flexibility in later modifying these colors. One of the approaches to figuring out a spot that has a lot of color variability is actually to bump up the saturation to 100, shuffle around these two sliders, and try to find the point where you can differentiate the hues the most. Now this might be a little bit too unspecific for you, in which case let's take a look at the soft proofing and how we can use it as a tool to help. So to use the soft proofing assist, I'm going to bring the saturation back down to 0 and hit the hotkey S, which will pull up the soft proofing interface. When you use soft proofing for the first time, a dialog box will come up asking you if you want to make a virtual copy or make this the proof. You want to make this the proof unless, you want several copies of this raw file going around your Lightroom, which you probably don't. So again, check make this the proof and then move on. Now the soft proofing assist file is attached to this tutorial download, so if you'd like to use it, you'll have to copy it to the following folder, and you can also find these instructions in a PDF attached to the download as well. Once you have that file copied into that folder, you can click on this profile, go to Other, and you should be able to import it. Make sure to have Include Display Profiles checked so that we can actually see it. So here's mine. I'm going to import that with OK, and this is the wonderful view that we're going to get of Demonic Keep. Now a quick skip over to Camera Raw in case you're working in that program instead. To pull up that soft proofing, you'll go down here to this line of text and switch the color space to the skin checker. Once you're done, then you can go back to whichever color space you were previously working in. Now, as you're probably realizing, this is not quite as pleasant and simple as in Lightroom, where we simply have to use the hotkey S, which is why I've been working in Lightroom as of recently. So back to Lightroom. Now, once we have this very scary looking view pulled up, we can get started on the white balance. Here, you'll see when I shuffle the temperature slider around, she looks all kinds of different versions of scary, but also we get this magenta cast on one side, on the cooler side, versus the yellow cast on the warmer side. So that's a good indicator for us in terms of where we want to land in the middle. We want to see a little bit of both. That means that we are in a balanced spot. Seeing a little bit of yellow and a little bit of magenta is a good balance. Then we can also come at this with the tint slider. Although this generally, for most classic light sources, so tungsten or daylight, we don't want to have the tint, too far out there. That's mainly for correcting for any sort of neon or maybe fluorescent color casts. Generally here, I'll keep it pretty close to 0, so maybe around +7, and then the skin looks really healthy right around here as well. We have a little bit of that magenta, a little bit of the yellow. Now what we are seeing is that some of the skin is still not fully included in this mask. So now we're going to move on to the luminosity corrections. And here you'll see when I shuffle the exposure slider around, a little bit lower is where the highlights are perfectly included, and a little bit higher is where the shadows are included. So in this case, I'll try to find a balanced spot with my exposure slider that's somewhere right in between, so maybe negative 0.2 or 0.25, and then I'm going to compensate with the highlights and the shadows. So maybe I'll take the highlights down a little bit and the shadows up a little bit, and I'll do the same with the whites and the blacks. Now this is a good point to switch back into the normal view, so hit S to exit the soft proofing, and now we can finalize our exposure settings up here. So something that you might notice is if you bring your highlights all the way down, and especially if you bring your shadows all the way up, it's going to produce this very, very unpleasant looking skin. And that's because we are losing the natural contrast distribution. So essentially this is somewhat equivalent to bringing in a reverse S-curve onto an image, and as you can see, it doesn't exactly do the skin any favors. So that's something that we want to avoid. We don't want to go too crazy on our minus highlights or plus shadows, and of course the equivalent in the whites and blacks. So we'll want to find a balance somewhere that both works to, reduce the dynamic range of the skin as well as maintain the natural contrast distribution. For me, I usually find my limits to be somewhere close to the point of negative and plus 20. If you want to go a little heavier or a little more subtle on that, that's okay too. It'll heavily depend on your image, of course. So this looks good to me. I'm also going to pull back the whites and blacks a little bit. Maybe right around here. Now I can double check this with my soft proofing if I'd like to, and this looks pretty good to me. I think I've, made the most out of what we have here. Now if we feel like combining methods and double checking our work with the soft proofing assist, we can also at this point bump up the saturation and just double check that we have, all the different colors available to us, and in this case this looks great. We do have full color variability. At this point, I also want to mention that if we have this balanced white balance, we are going to lose a little bit of perceived saturation. So I like to bring some back, maybe right around 20 or 25, sort of depending on the image, and that brings back a little bit of life into her face. Of course, you can also work with, a warmer or a cooler white balance if you're making a specific stylistic choice. However, if you're going for balance, this is the way to do it. So at this point we've finished up with all of our skin-based adjustments, and we can use the adjustment brush to make any other changes to the rest of the image. In this case, the only thing that I might want to adjust, seeing as there is not much of an environment here, is that we do have some underexposure. To see under and overexposure, we can use these clipping buttons. There's no overexposure, but there is some underexposure, which we'll see in blue over here. So I'm just going to raise the shadows a little bit and paint that onto that area to eliminate that underexposure. We can still use this indicator here to figure out if we've eliminated it yet, so we might have to raise it even a little bit more, or perhaps raise the blacks. Of course, keep this subtle. You don't want it to look unnatural. So right around here seems to do the trick. Now we have a perfect amount of full range of information available to us. Our skin tone is balanced, and I'd say we're ready to get started in Photoshop. So let's recap the progress of this raw processor section. Here's our before, and here's our after. Our objective here was to create a strong base for us to work off in Photoshop by balancing the overall skin color and luminosity. The tools we used were the white balance, the exposure sliders, we used a soft proofing assist to check the skin tone, and lastly we used the adjustment brush in order to make minor changes, especially to the environment. Alright, we're good to go, so let's bring this into Photoshop. Personally, I like to import raw files as a smart object to have flexibility if needed, so let's do that. And I'll show you how to do that in Camera Raw as well if you're working on that platform. So if we wanted to import a smart object from Camera Raw, we would go down here to the workflow settings and make sure that the box Open in Photoshop as Smart Object is checked. Importing a raw file as a smart object means that we can double-click this little icon to go back into our raw processor and make changes on the raw level if we so choose.